Given that Tony Stark is usually in a leadership role within the Avengers, you'd expect that the team hasn't done much to ruin his life. After all, everything they do is supposedly under his orders. Well, not entirely, because Tony having this role more often than not leads him to being screwed over repeatedly, either because other members place too much pressure on him, or because he funds the Avengers, and thus any moves that ruin the Avengers' finances also run him dry of money pretty damn fast. And while Iron Man isn't always the perfect hero, he is always trying his best to do the right thing, which is why it hurts to see him repeatedly get belittled and sabotaged by pretty much every other member of the Avengers. So with that in mind, I'm Will for What Culture, and here are 10 times the Avengers ruined Tony Stark's life. Number 10. Destroying his home, repeatedly. Various comics. The Avengers mansion has been destroyed an almost unimaginable amount of times, having been reduced to rubble in Avengers Disassembled, Avengers Under Siege, and twice in the New Avengers in recent history alone. It's often forgotten that said luxurious mansion is actually the property of Tony Stark, and that its upkeep is funded by a mixture of the government and Iron Man, with the latter paying the majority of the bills for the place the Avengers call both a base and a home. As such, it's kind of awful that the team are usually responsible for either destroying the place or otherwise failing to protect it, taking another huge chunk out of Tony's wealth. While you'd presume that doesn't matter, after all the guy is a billionaire, he's legitimately gone bankrupt trying to keep the place afloat at least twice. Number 9. Trying to kill him for things he didn't do. Iron Man 301 to 306. Were you to read the issues of Iron Man where several heroes call out the metal hero for his questionable business practices back to back for 5 issues, you'd instinctively think that Tony Stark was presumably in the wrong. But within the context of the issue, the case is anything but. This is because all the sketchy things that Stark Enterprises have done were not organized by Tony, but rather orchestrated by his nemesis Obadiah Stane during the time he had control of the company. With this in mind, the whole thing should just be resolved by Iron Man explaining it to his loyal allies. Only, literally nobody gives Tony the time to talk, instead busting his door down before so much as asking him what had happened. Number 8. Making him start drinking again. Fear Itself 4. While the most harrowing moment of Fear Itself will always be Thor's death, the runner-up for this award has to be when we see Iron Man return to drinking, because this sacrifice is needed to summon Odin and help the Avengers save the day. You'd presume that this was a plan that the rest of the Avengers has no idea about, if not for the fact that before this, Captain America says to the team, "You have your assignment," which makes it pretty clear that the Avengers had actively made Tony break his years of sobriety as part of their big plan. Sure, it worked, but you can't help but think there were surely other ways that the Avengers could have summoned Odin, such as perhaps using his son Thor, who likely could have called up his dear old dad at any time. Number 7. Being blamed for Civil War. Civil War. So, to begin, it's worth stating that Iron Man is not in the right, per se, in Civil War. Tony is forced into an extremely difficult situation for the series' duration, as it's only him and Peter Parker that know one crucial thing. The government were already trying to find a way to make superheroes reveal their secret identities, which we see them try and fail to argue against in The Amazing Spider-Man 530. This in mind, it's profoundly unfair that Iron Man is made out to be the cause behind all the bad stuff that happens in Civil War, because it's not that he wants to fight and detain his friends and allies, it's that he's aware that if no hero sides with the government, superheroes themselves will likely be outlawed. Number 6. Kicking him out of the team instead of helping him with his alcohol problem. Iron Man 169. Now, dealing with alcoholism isn't easy, even in the often far simpler world of comics. However, it doesn't take much contemplating to know what your role is should you discover your pal is struggling with addiction, in that you should be there for them as much as you can be and try to help them out in such a difficult time. When Tony is replaced by James Rhodes due to his alcoholism getting out of hand, the Avengers' reaction is nothing. Even when Captain America goes to look for him, he only goes as far to having a go at Tony before ditching him in his shady motel to presumably die of alcohol poisoning. Number 5. Not listening to him. Civil War 2 and various comics. While Tony isn't entirely without blame in Civil War II, it's worth remembering that, for the most part, every questionable thing he does is in retaliation to someone else's far worse decision. In fact, Tony's actions in the series are largely reactions to the fact that nobody tells him anything. While this sounds like a petty complaint, the fact he isn't told about the fact the Avengers have decided to go fight Thanos means he doesn't get to change Rhodey's armor accordingly, which results in his old friend's death. While Captain Marvel and other characters try to argue that Rhodey knew the risks of fighting the Mad Titan, it's arguable that this isn't even what Tony is mad about. In actual fact, he seems more mad that he didn't get a chance to give his friend the best fighting chance he could have had. This continues to be a trend for the whole of Civil War II, with Tony being made out to be the bad guy once more for the crime of wanting to make sure nobody got unfairly arrested, which doesn't seem like a bad idea at all. Number 4, not realizing he had been turned evil or trying to help him. Superior Iron Man. While the Superior Iron Man series, which contains a story wherein Tony Stark is turned evil and becomes a sort of dictator over San Francisco, is brilliant, it's a brilliant story that makes you ask one question the whole way through: where the hell are the Avengers? This comic occurs after the Axis storyline, which saw all the Avengers be made into villains, only for all of them to be transformed back at the end of the series, aside from Iron Man, who was able to use a force field to stay in his villainous form. As such, you'd expect that the rest of the Earth's mightiest heroes would immediately recognize that something had gone wrong with him and help out their friend and teammates. Yet, the entire comic takes place without any Avengers appearing, despite the fact that Tony had been more or less publicly broadcasting his misdeeds the entire time, in ways that may as well have "I am not acting like myself" written all over them in a big gold Sharpie. Number 3, blaming him for trying to save the day. Iron Man 229. There are a few moments in the Iron Man series as genuinely painful as seeing Tony be berated by the West Coast Avengers for beating up everyone who is using his stolen suit designs for their own means. While it initially seems as though Tony is the one in the wrong, as it turns out that until this issue he hasn't explained why he's beating down every person with a suit of armor similar to his, the tables turn in Iron Man 229, where he finally spells out how he's been hunting down people who are using his stolen goods. Although you'd expect everyone to understand, the Avengers still decide to give him grief, telling Tony he needs to stop picking fights or he'll be kicked off the team. It's a difficult one because you can, in a way, see where Hawkeye is coming from, as Iron Man going on what appears to be an all-out rampage is incredibly bad press for the Avengers themselves. However, the scenario is essentially that the whole group realize that Tony is in the right with what he is doing and then still tell him to stop doing it so their reputation doesn't get damaged. Number 2, abusing him for being mind-controlled. Avengers Disassembled. All in all, the Avengers Disassembled storyline is a bad time for pretty much everyone in the Avengers, with the main team suffering the most. Of all of this assorted misery, Iron Man maybe gets the worst of it, as the villainous Scarlet Witch uses her powers to make it appear as though Tony is drunk beyond belief during a vitally important speech he has to give at the UN. It ends in total disaster, and sees him both embarrass himself and lose his job as the American Secretary of Defense. When Tony returns to the Avengers to share with them the fact that there's clearly someone targeting them, he's met with Hank Pym screaming at him, berating him for being drunk at the event. When Tony goes on to defend himself in a completely coherent and sober manner, both Hawkeye and Ant-Man rip into him, telling him they don't believe him and that he's basically the worst person ever, which understandably breaks the heart of a self-reformed alcoholic like Tony. Number 1, making him kill himself. Avengers The Crossing. The Crossing is a story so controversial that it would be gently written out of existence after occurring, likely because the creative team behind the Avengers realized how immoral the story makes the squad of heroes appear. Because the story covers Iron Man having been brainwashed by Kang, which naturally makes him act in pretty evil ways. Despite having nobly fought for Tony's side for a fair amount of time, including fighting with him against Kang, the Avengers do zero checks to see if something is wrong with Iron Man and instead decide to replace him. With who? Well, none other than a young Tony Stark, who they take from the past to fight his current self. This is, by all means, one of the single most terrible plans of all time. Firstly, given this Tony is way younger, there's a pretty good chance he'll be defeated and killed in the fight, which the Avengers are surely aware of, meaning they just don't care enough about this likely possibility. Secondly, it's pretty sketchy that the Avengers got a young, impressionable Tony to fight the evil Iron Man instead of of just working out how to take him down themselves. After all, there's a pretty good chance that having to brutally murder an adult version of yourself would mess you up pretty bad. And yet the Avengers happily send the teen genius to either die or get seriously traumatized in the fight ahead of him. Nice work, heroes. And there you have it, folks. 10 times the Avengers ruined Tony Stark's life. Feel free to drop this video a like if you enjoyed it, and drop me a follow on Twitter at @uslydogU. I'm Will for What Culture, thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.